Associate Professor of International Economics, are joining Director Plummer to have this conversation. I'm going to hand over to Nina first, then I'll pass along to Mike, and then we'll let Filippo bring up the rear of the conversation. I'm going to give them each 10 minutes to talk. If at any time you want to ask a question to any of the panelists, I would invite you to use the Q&A box that's located in the bottom middle of your screen. So if you hover your mouse over the screen, you'll activate a bar at the bottom, and then there's a little Q&A blurb. Please do not send any questions via the chat box because we won't see them and so won't be able to bring them into the conversation. And we do want to hear from you. So please put your chats into the Q&A box, and after the initial presentations, we'll be able to do those in as efficient a manner as we can. With that introductory comment, Nina, I'm going to hand over to you. As you share your screen, please be sure to share the PowerPoint itself rather than the full screen so that we don't have anything obstruct the view of what you're trying to show. Over to you, Nina.
Great. Can you all see that now? Yes, you can see my screen. Wonderful. Thanks so much to you all for coming. It's wonderful, while we may not be with you in person, to be with you virtually. And thanks to my colleagues, Mike and Erik, for the introduction. So I get the job of kicking us off this morning and to talk a little bit, as an IR scholar would, about the ramifications of COVID for international cooperation. And I want to speak to 3 questions and try and keep that to my 10 minutes, which I'm sure Erik will keep me on task. The first is, what are the international consequences of COVID-19 beyond the global north? And I'm going to argue that we should really be focusing more on what's happening in the global south and in countries like in Africa, Asia, Latin America. Who is taking international leadership? And I will argue that it's certainly not the US, unsurprisingly. And thirdly, what sort of new world order can we imagine post-COVID? And I guess this will be a conversation we can continue in Q&A, and I'll provide some initial reflections, but by no means definitive ones there. So firstly, what are the international consequences of COVID-19? Well, many of you will be very familiar with this graph by now from our colleagues in Johns Hopkins, Baltimore, and it's very obvious that so far, COVID-19 is really a rich person's, or a rich country disease, I should say. So we can see the vast majority of cases in what we can say is in the global north and developed countries, the US, Spain, Italy, the UK, France, Germany, having the most cases. However, I think it's worth pointing out that we know as the disease spreads, that the global south is likely to also be hit very hard, both by its health consequences and by the economic impact. Some say, for instance, in South Africa, that we'll only see the peak of the virus in September. And we also know that many countries in the global south do not have enough intensive beds. Malawi, for example, has only about 0.14 beds per 100,000. Bangladesh, about 0.7 critical care beds for 100,000 people. And that compares to, say, Italy at 12.5, or Germany at around 29, 30, or between 29 and 33. I've seen different estimates. We also know that many in Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and Latin America depend on informal work. They depend on daily wages, and they can't shift their work easily online like we're doing here. Government bailouts may not be possible in many countries, or at least not at the scale that we've seen in other countries in the global north. And Oxfam, in fact, just in the last couple of weeks has estimated that COVID could push about 0.5 billion people into poverty. We also know, and as my colleagues I'm sure can speak to in depth, that many countries in the global south will be responding to COVID-19 when they're already facing very burdensome debt repayments. In fact, a 2019 World Bank report noted that we have seen, and this is before COVID, the largest debt surge in nearly 5 decades. So we can only imagine how that will develop. And there have been people speaking out about this. I think particularly prominent has been the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Abiy Ahmed, who said that, in a Financial Times letter a few weeks back, if COVID is not beaten in Africa, it will return to haunt us. And he elaborated that momentary victory by a rich country and controlling the virus at a national level, coupled with, as we've seen, travel bans, border closures, may give a semblance of accomplishment, but we all know this is a stopgap. Only global victory can bring this pandemic to an end. And in the lead up to the spring meeting of the IMF and the World Bank, he and other world leaders, I've got the list there, wrote a letter, again, calling for a debt moratorium on all bilateral and multilateral debt payments, both public and private, until the pandemic has passed. They also called for a large economic stimulus package of at least 100 billion, which has been assessed by Africa's finance ministers in the UN. And there have been, as I'm sure some of you are aware, some progress on that front. The IMF did approve debt relief for 25 of the world's poorest countries. And the G20 as well has suspended bilateral debt payments from the 1st of May, from today, for the rest of this year. However, some critics have said that that's just kicking the can down the road because, of course, the countries will need to pay back later on in 2021 unless a change happens. And also, many have pointed out that the private sector has no obligation to follow what the G20 has set. So who's taking international leadership in this space? Well, I think many would not look to the US for leadership at this point. President Trump has been ineffective domestically at dealing with COVID, from his delayed response to undermining scientific advice and his own scientists regularly in press conferences. We've also seen the politicization of the WHO, which President Trump has attacked in the last 2 weeks for being too China-centric, and he's threatened to cut financing to the WHO. And many commentators have even talked about a failure of US leadership in the US, let alone globally. So others have said, maybe we should look to China. And China has, of course, been sending medical aid as well as medical assistance in the form of doctors. Here's an example in Italy. Around the world, they've sent around 2 million surgical masks, more than 200,000 advanced masks, and 17 tons of medical supplies to Europe. They've also sent medical gear around Southern Asia, to New Zealand, my own country, the Pacific Islands, to the UK. I read a report that China had sent packaging that said, keep calm and cure coronavirus to the UK. But it's worth noting that some of this, this medical equipment that has been dispatched from China has failed to meet international standards. The Netherlands was forced to recall around 600,000 face masks, and Spain jettisoned about 50,000 testing kits from China after it was revealed they only had a 30% accuracy rate. So that leads me to my final section, to question, well, what is, if there will be one, new world order after COVID? And of course, many of these questions, as we're all grappling with, depend partly on how long this pandemic goes on for. Will it be 12, 18 months, longer? What sort of waves of lockdowns might we see? Government restrictions? And once we do get a vaccine, will it be easy for all to access? Or will it be easier for people in the global north? Now, some predict that we will see the rise of China and the decline of the US, and that this is just magnifying already existing trends in the international order, that the US was already in decline and China so-called rising. And I think a lot will also depend on what happens in the US election this year with Trump and Biden. But I think it's very clear we have seen China playing a stronger role internationally, whether it be through UN institutions or through bilateral aid and their Belt and Road project. But I'd also note, I don't think it's simply a question of China versus the US. There have been a lot of conversations about what other leaders have been doing, whether it be South Korea's response and giving PPE, or New Zealand, my own country, and the Prime Minister there, Jacinda Ardern, who's been widely applauded for an effective and empathetic response. So that's one question: who's going to be, the new world leader? Another is, what's going to happen to globalization? And there've been a lot of commentary around this theme with people like Stephen Walt, a classic realist who we discussed in my IR theories class just 2 weeks ago, this op-ed where he claims that we may be seeing the high water of contemporary globalization, which is now behind us. And I think there's a lot of questions there to ask, which I'm sure will be good to discuss with my other panelists about whether we see new forms of globalization. We're already seeing our classes go online. How does supply chains change? How does other forms of business take place in an online world? And finally, a last question I want to leave us with is what can we do during this period to create a new world order that some want to see? I think there's been a lot of debate about how can we rethink and improve our economies and societies and global politics during this period of lockdown. In my research on climate advocacy, I've seen a lot of activists involved in this question. And just this week, Angela Merkel in Berlin continued to hold online, albeit, her Petersburg Climate Dialogue Conference, which is an annual conference of heads of states discussing climate change. And she really urged world leaders to keep an eye on climate protection and to not retreat into national boundaries, but to continue to think internationally and to prioritize climate change within their COVID response. I'll leave it at that and look forward to Q&A and our conversation with you. Thanks so much.
That was excellent, Nina, and perfectly to time. Well done. I'm sure that's not going to be followed by your colleagues, but we'll have to see if they can manage. Just as a reminder for all of you who are listening, wherever you may be, please do post all of your questions and comments in the Q&A box, which you'll find right next to the chat box. If you put them in the Q&A box, we'll be sure to get to them as soon as the initial presentations are finished. Mike, would you like to take over now?
Sure, Eric, thanks. Thanks very much. Can everybody see my screen? Okay, great. Well, I'm going to talk on something a little bit different, and that is looking at COVID-19 and the longer term implications for trade. And what I think we see emerging here is both some scenarios for conflict as well as for cooperation. Now, COVID-19 obviously has created a major shock to trade. The WTO this month forecasts a decrease of 13 to 32% in trade in 2020. It expects a rebound next year, but of course that's uncertain. It suggests that the biggest drops will be in sectors that involve complex value chains, and we've seen a lot of analysis that would support that. Trade and services has been especially affected due to restrictions on transport and travel and the connections to those two sectors. Digital trade will continue to grow, but it's very small compared to these other service sector shocks. So the future paths seem to be quite uncertain. And if I might just reproduce the forecasts by the WTO, what is interesting, I think, is here we've got for the forecast beginning 2020, you'll see a big drop in a pessimistic scenario. This is an optimistic scenario, and they're both significantly below what seemed to be a trend between 2011 and 2018. But I think it's important to note that that trend had already changed significantly at the global recession. All right, so in 2008, you saw a big drop, but before that, you had actually a pretty tight line of increase in globalization that through trade, that if it had continued would have been going in this direction. Instead, it went down this way, right? So it's not just about what's happening this year. In 2019, the trade actually fell not by much, by about 1%, but that was significant given past growth trends. And the reason for this had to do with various trade tensions, including the US-China trade war. It's also true that regional production chains had slowed down and had started to mature over this period. And those regional production networks had been driving a lot of the growth in trade prior to the global crisis. Now, China has been a key link in these global supply chains, but even before the US-China trade war, firms were moving out of China due to higher wages. So you're already seeing that structural change taking place. the phase one agreement between the US and China stabilized US-China relations this year, but COVID-19 bickering seems to have led to the markets the markets are becoming more pessimistic in this regard. There was recently a survey done by the US Chamber of Commerce in China and the US Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai, surveying firms about what they thought about COVID and what they're doing about COVID, and more importantly, what was going to happen after COVID. And a lot of them, an increasing number of them, said that they would be expediting their move out of China. So this is a major problem for Asia. First of all, there's an impasse at the WTO, which poses a special problem for the region, which depends more on the marketplace than other regions. Just to show you some data, a little bit dated, but these are some regional configurations according to trade GDP to show, let's say, as a proxy for how exposed they are to international trade. And so Latin America between 1991 and going into the mid 20-teens had risen, quite a bit. South Asia had risen as well. Africa was pretty flat, but the Asean region, which includes 630 million people, continued to grow to very high levels. In fact, about 100%. So anything that's happening in the global marketplace that's leading to conflict is going to be a problem for Asia. Also, there's been no major success at the multilateral level since the mid-1990s. And the economy was very different a generation ago. There was no digital economy, for example. Intellectual property was much less sensitive, if you will, than it is today. And yet we haven't had any new rules that we've created at the multilateral level to help to facilitate that trade. The Trump administration has many problems with the WTO and is essentially blocking the dispute settlement mechanism until reforms can be made. And that's possible. I think a lot of countries believe that the WTO dispute settlement process needs to be updated and upgraded. However, at the moment, it is at an impasse. And so since 85% of any trade disputes are taken to the appellate court, and the appellate court is not functioning right now, we are having some major issues. It's true that some countries in Asia, for example, Vietnam, have benefited to some degree due to the US-China trade war, but I think that that's just because it sped up the process of structural change from China, and Vietnam is benefiting from that. On the whole, the region has been negatively affected by this uncertainty and the rise in global protectionism. Phase one of the US-China agreement, which began in January, gave some hope for stability, but the recent COVID-19 related posturing and phase two problems, which are going to be very complicated, have created fears of long-term disruptions. So what has been Asia's response to this? In part to offset these problems, Asia has turned to its own regional integration programs, in particular the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement on Trans-Pacific Partnership, which many of you will recognize as the newly formed Trans-Pacific Partnership after the United States left it when the Trump administration took over. So that's 11 countries in the Asia-Pacific region, including New Zealand, Nina. And this year, it's hoped that the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement will be signed. That's the goal that the members have set. That is 15 countries within Asia itself. It used to be 16, including India, but India for the moment has pulled out. So it's got a fairly high probability of being signed this year. But again, the COVID crisis has thrown a wrench in the works, so maybe it'll be delayed to some degree. Okay. These programs, these mega regional arrangements will begin to set new rules for commerce in the 21st century in the absence of these sort of rules in the multilateral domain. These could have, and as well, these regional arrangements might also have important strategic implications. So it's not all about economics, obviously. The estimates I've done on these groupings with my co-author suggest that this sort of cooperation will actually more than compensate for the trade war. China will be the big loser economically, but it will gain strategically through the RCEP agreement. But the US will lose economically, and its strategic influence will continue to fall in the region once these arrangements move forward. Just in looking at some figures that we have put together in a paper that's going to be coming out in a few weeks, a modeling paper, we estimate, and these are long-term projections, so this is through a steady state in 2030, that the trade war would cost global incomes $301 billion a year. Whereas if you add on the CPTPP as well as RCEP, with or without India, it actually more than compensates for what's going on in the trade war. Of course, that's at the global level. The distribution of those gains are very different. The US loses, China still loses, but the region gains from this sort of cooperation. So with COVID-19, will have strong negative effects on trade in the short term. It will expedite changes already in motion in terms of supply chains with longer term implications going forward. The case for closer cooperation is made stronger by COVID-19, but that doesn't mean it will bring countries together necessarily, and it certainly isn't doing so in the key US-China context. There's a real chance that conflict will have permanent effects. Economic distancing, if you'll excuse the expression, could result from this. In any event, post-COVID, strengthening rules with respect to export controls and beggar thy neighbor policies, which we even saw emerged in Europe at one point, will need to be a priority in the future. It's always going to be complicated to solve these issues. Continuing from what Nina was saying, it's going to take leadership, and the question is whether or not we have that leadership. So I'll stop there.
That's terrific, Mike. Thank you so much for that. Listen, just one final reminder, please do make sure you post your questions in the Q&A box, which you'll find next to the chat box in the bar that controls Zoom at the bottom of your window. And that way, when we turn to the question and answer session, we'll be able to make sure to address the questions that you want to raise. Filippo, over to you.
Thank you, Erik, and a pleasure being with all of you, although virtually. So I will employ my 10 minutes to talk about, emphasize how Europe, and by comparison the United States, has dealt with the lockdown crisis, what will go down in history as a lockdown crisis, and therefore what kind of consequences we can expect. And I think if we take a closer look at what is going on, maybe we'll be more effective at predicting the consequence. And, you know, just to give the bottom line, it's going to be a story about the size of the intervention and, most importantly, the timing of the intervention, because here we have a shock that is somewhat different from the past, actually very different from the past. Let me just be specific about it. It's a two-tier shock that is characterized by an ignition, a very brutal ignition, you know, what we all know, a sudden sharp contraction in our ability to produce that has then been followed, and now we are in that second stage, actually, or at least the second phase is coming in with a demand shock. So because our ability to produce has suddenly contracted, a lot of productive entities, firms, companies around the globe entered into a very severe liquidity shortage. So it's not just an issue for workers that are not earning their wages or salary anymore, but it's also a matter of liquidity needs that are there. And this, of course, affects not just what people do in the present, but also what people expect from the future. So their attitude toward consumption, toward investment. So you see very quickly how this supply shock, you know, of the most brutal sense of the COVID-19 shock, suddenly has become a demand shock. Now, dealing with one and without dealing with the other is a huge mistake. Right now, as you will see throughout my presentation, we are dealing mostly with the latter. We're dealing mostly with the demand shock, which is not a mistake per se, but it's a mistake if that is the only action that we take. So if we think about how we are dealing with it in North America or in Europe, we see essentially that we are pushing to the full extent the traditional lever that we have. So let me just use, and these two levers are nothing else than the monetary response and the fiscal response. Let me just use the monetary response, a discussion of how the monetary response has differed in Europe compared to the United States, and then we'll do the same for fiscal in order to understand what are the challenges ahead. Okay. So monetary policy. The US has employed swiftly a full array of tools, old and new. Okay, accepting lower quality collateral, entering the corporate credit market directly. I mean, the Federal Reserve right now is through the corporate facility program is entering this unprecedented territory of providing direct funding. So also in the primary market for corporation, total intervention. Huge, sizable in the order of $2.3 trillion. What about Europe? Well, Europe has followed the lead in terms of kind of intervention, but the size is remarkably smaller. Okay, so you get a lot of acronyms. You can go crazy with acronyms in Europe. Okay, but essentially it's about liquidity to the bank, liquidity to the government, and extra liquidity to the government because there's a pandemic going on. These are what these three acronyms mean. Now, unfortunately, the content of this policy hasn't been as smooth in Europe as it has been in the US. So here I want just to point out to your attention two things. You'll see my eyes moving just because I have few screens and I'm unable to move the presentation across the screen. So here is the first intervention. Okay, the major conference, the presidents of the ECB stepping in, saying, okay, we're there, we'll do whatever we can do, but by the way, we're not here to close the spread. So we're not here to make sure that the spread for government countries that are peripheral in the Eurozone, peripheral geographically, will go down. Soon after that statement was made, what happened to the spread? Of course, but they went up. As soon as you say that you're not there to push them down, the spread go up. And that's actually what happened. And the increase was so sharp, and you see here for the usual suspect, Italy, Portugal, Spain, and Greece, but that the ECB was forced to intervene less than a week after that. And it intervened under closed market by basically introducing a new package, the pandemic program, the PEP, and you see that created a shock. A shock now in the desired direction, so of closing the spread. And after that, the ECB said, oh, just let me be clear about this. The usual rule for intervention, that is how much we buy of our debt, will not hold for this case. The usual rule is what typically we refer to as the capital key. Let me just be specific about what this means, okay?
Filippo.
Yeah.
Can you start your slide deck again, because it's not moving for anyone else?
You're not seeing what I see?
No, because I think you've shared your home screen and not the PowerPoint.
All right, I'm very sorry about that. Thank you. All right, see here. All right, so I was talking to myself, I understand now. This is the one, can you see the screen now? All right, okay, thank you. Erik, feel free to interrupt me sooner. So this is basically what I was talking about before. So the uncertainty regarding behind the conduct of monetary policy delivered first a surge in the spread, then a later intervention, and then also a relaxation of the standard rules for intervention, that is the capital key. What does that mean? That means that if you see this is the total amount of purchase of government debt undertaken by the ECB, and you see that basically the big player has been the additional program, this emergency program that has been introduced 1 week after the initial conference, the PEP program. And you see here the size of it. Now, that program is particularly flexible, meaning, you know, the ECB can buy, also not respecting the fact that Germany is a larger economy compared to Italy. So let me just skip to that. And the consequence of that is what you can be seen in this slide here. You see that thanks to this additional relaxation of the ECB intervention, we've had a relatively over-purchasing of debt from countries that are particularly under pressure during the coronavirus crisis. Italy, of course, Spain, you see also France, all of them going up. So there was a little bit of uncertainty, smaller size, but also late intervention. This is, what about fiscal? You know, so the other level, the standard lever to deal with this. After some sort of a Congress delay, you know, a very major intervention in the order of $2 trillion, okay, under the CARES Act. What happened in Europe? Well, in Europe, the response was mostly national, on average, 3% of GDP. Just to give a sense about the numbers here, if you, $2 trillion are almost 10% of GDP, given the nominal amount of GDP in the United States before the crisis. You understand that if the European response is around 3% of GDP, there is a large difference in terms of sizes. In addition to that, of course, there's also a European level of intervention, a multilateral level of intervention, if you want. And here you've got a problem, because here the size is very minor. You know, this is just 37 billion were mobilized, and then the possibility to access an additional credit liquidity line of credit through the ESM, public guarantees through the European Investment Bank, and some sort of a program to pay for unemployment. But you see, at the end of this, given they're certainly behind these three projects, these three programs, we're talking about a much smaller intervention, okay? Then, of course, people like to talk about also the recovery plan, a huge $1.5 trillion plan, but here we're still even more behind. So what's the bottom line here? If you just want to give it a sense about the difference of the two interventions, here you got your number, okay? So that you can also parameterize them in reference to the size of the economy. And this, of course, you know, the difference in size, let aside the timing, the difference in size is obviously very apparent. So what are the questions that remain open to answer here, to address here? Number one question is, once we reactivate the economy is not going to reactivate altogether at the same speed, okay? What does that mean? Let's try to get a sense of that. This is the impact of the crisis in the different sector, okay? And you see that, of course, different sectors are impacted very, very, very differently, okay? We go from hospitality, food services down 60% to agriculture that has suffered only a minor, so to speak, loss. But this, of course, poses the question, how do you deal with the reactivation of an economy where some sectors and therefore some goods restart sooner than others? If you want some more general question that we have to address, what if, beside the difference in resilience in sectors, we also have a difference in resilience across countries? What does that do to trade integration? And this, of course, will have a crucial impact for the European economy. The ECB has just come out today with this projection. This is how much foreign markets matter for the euro area. And you see that even in the best possible scenario, the blue line here, we're talking about going back to the level of trade we had before at the beginning of 2021. So, well, 9 months from now, to go back to where we were at the beginning of this crisis. So the question that we have to ask here is this, how challenging is that if Europe stays out of the trade integration for longer, okay? Do we get a reduction in trade, or do we get to something like diversion in trade? Final point, okay? Sure, we are intervening very aggressively from a fiscal point of view, and also from a monetary point of view, but this is creating a huge amount of debt. How huge? Well, you know, let me give you a reference point here. This is the amount of debt that advanced economies alone had at the end of 2011, okay? So at the end of the Great Recession. This is where we will likely be at the end of 2020, in 2021. It's an unprecedented level of debt in comparison to GDP for advanced economies. It's higher than what we had at the end of World War II, much higher. And therefore, this, of course, opens questions regarding the ability to preserve the level of financial integration that we've experienced until now. I will stop here, and I'm very sorry about my difficulty in showing the initial slides.
That's terrific, Filippo. Thank you very much. I've received a number of questions in our Q&A box. Nina, I want to go to you first and combine some of the questions that have come up. And I guess the focus is really on this idea of a global void. And the global void is important because as at least one of our guests has pointed out, on the one hand, the United States spends an enormous amount of money supporting international organizations and providing charitable resources and development assistance. On the other hand, the efforts that are made by countries like China and Russia, we should probably add, are probably more symbolic than real in many of these respects. So I guess the question is, to what extent do they really challenge American leadership in that regard? And at the same time, to what extent is it safe for us to discount the role that Europe might play, either on its own or in the context of the transatlantic relationship? So if you could fill us in on that world order aspect, that would be great.
Great, and thank you for that. I think it's a really important question because, as my talk indicated, there is great debate about whether or not this is a new phenomenon, and I think most would agree this tension between the US and China has been one going for some time, and then B, how much of China's help is more symbolic than substantive. So one of the questions that people have suggested is that, you know, the Chinese aid, as I mentioned, is ineffective, and that the US, as I think it was Richard Albright, thank you, I saw that in the chat, pointed out, a lot of financing continues to go from the US to international humanitarian institutions. So I think there can be an argument there about it being symbolic. However, I would say that there has been important decisions that the US has not led on internationally where it could have, maybe in a different scenario under a different leader, whether it be Republican or Democrat. To give you a concrete example of this, the UN Security Council has really been sidelined in this debate. And I've just been reading a very good analysis of how in Ebola they were much more active. They were able to quickly get engaged and have a Security Council debate on what the international response to Ebola is. However, with COVID, you would think it would be obvious the Security Council should be debating this. They didn't until early April. And that wasn't because of China, and it wasn't because of the US. The US initially blocked it. It was because the non-permanent members of the UN Security Council, including the Dominican Republic, had to take the lead. And so I think here you see it goes beyond symbolism. I mean, sure, Security Council resolutions aren't going to change the world, but actually trying to get traction, trying to get international cooperation, trying to think beyond your own nation state, that's what the UN is about. And the fact that the UN Security Council, we don't have any leadership from any of the permanent five, and certainly not the US or China on taking that forward, I think is more than just symbolism. So that would be one thing I would respond. For people who are interested in thinking more about China's role, and particularly in the UN, I can put a short plug for something. We had a seminar in Bologna earlier this year with a scholar from Oxford, Rosemary Foote, who's just about to release in the coming future a book called Reshaping the UN from Within, that looks at how China has become increasingly engaged in the United Nations, but is also reshaping its norms around human protection. And I think there's a lot of scholarship out there on these topics. Was there anything I've missed here? You had a second question, Erik, about the EU. Can you remind me?
The question was really about whether Europe could play a strategic role either on its own or in the context of the transatlantic relationship. Obviously, there's tension in the transatlantic relationship right now, but could the EU help bring that relationship back together and support some kind of more strengthened collective response? Yeah,
and I think if listeners had a chance to read through the signatories of the Financial Times letter that I showed up about calling for a moratorium on debt at the IMF spring meeting, you would have noticed that they were all EU leaders and African leaders. So I think there's a concrete example of European leaders from the Netherlands, from France, from Conte, in Italy, Merkel, were taking a stance. It was one of the rare stances I think I have seen in recent times to be thinking beyond national boundaries, to be thinking beyond even regional, because as Erik can clarify this, and my other colleagues, great debate here about solidarity in the Eurozone, to think at the international level. So I think there have been some examples of that. However, I guess the scale of the crisis domestically has meant that that's been far and few between. And I think the other example I'd give was what I mentioned at the end of my talk with Angela Merkel trying to take some leadership around issues like climate change, because of course, COVID comes on top of a series of other important international issues which countries are trying to deal with, and her government's prioritization of we need to continue to think about climate change in our response to COVID. And the question is, how do we encourage governments to do that? And they had the summit on Monday and Tuesday of this week and in Berlin on that topic.
Now, Mike, if I can pick up on some of the things that Nina just said, but bring them more into your domain, I guess there were two big issues that come out. One is about the extent to which the disruption of global supply chains is really going to limit China's ability to play anything like an effective global leadership role. Is that going to emerge as a strong constraint on China's economic performance? The other is about the tension between the different trade projects that you mentioned. It seems as though the CPTPP and the RCEP are geopolitically competing projects that represent very different kinds of agreements. Can you see how they fit together effectively, or is there some necessary tension there?
Okay, thanks. Very interesting questions. First, I'd like to compliment you, Erik, on being able to rattle off those acronyms, which do not exactly flow off the tongue very easily. With respect to the supply chains and China's role, I think that this process has been in effect for a while. I don't see I think it's part of its process of maturing as an economy. I remember it was just 10 years ago, looking at data actually that the US government had, it estimated that 48% of the imports that came into China were processing imports, meaning they came into the country duty-free with the requirement that they had to be exported. So those are part of these supply chains and these production networks that China were part of. I mean, so that was almost half of China's imports. Today, that's less than a third. It's already been increased. Through its recent 2 5-year plans, this idea of increasing value add of its own in these supply chains has been growing. And so I think this is something that is just a natural part of China's evolution. It's being sped up by recent events, by a trade war, by COVID perhaps. But I don't think it's going to constrain China's rise. I think that's something that we should actually anticipate. In terms of CPTPP and RCEP being geopolitical rivalries, I mean, the TPP and the RCEP, in a way, were thought to be geopolitical rivalries, in particular because the TPP was being led by the United States very aggressively, and that started about 2009, and it got a lot of momentum. And China and Asean sort of launched this RCEP agreement beginning in November of 2012, because China saw this at first as a way that the TPP was being used as a way to contain it. I think it became satisfied that that wasn't what the US was trying to do. Competition, certainly, but not containment. And so China thought, okay, we're not ready perhaps to go in with the TPP yet. It's a very advanced agreement, but we could do something here and let's move forward. And so together with ASEAN, to be an RCEP member, you have to have a free trade area in place with ASEAN. It started moving forward with this agreement. And I don't think that there's going to be too much, even back then, too much competition, because you had a lot of membership overlap, right? Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei, you had Japan, which are in both agreements. So that was never going to get out of control. And originally, if you go back to 2010, APEC was thinking about a vision over time as to what the region should look like. And this at the time was very much supported by the United States to create a region of open trade and investment by 2020 to begin negotiations this year. And it was supposed to have 2 tracks. It was literally written in this document in 2010. One was going to be the TPP because it had started, and another would be an Asian track, which ends up being RCEP. And the idea would be these tracks would come together in the longer term in a region-wide arrangement. And so, I mean, that is, that's very challenging. Certainly in the current context, it's very challenging. But it's not supposed to have the kind of a negative competition that one would normally think in these sort of arrangements.
So Filippo, I'm getting a lot of questions both about debt and about macroeconomics that I wonder if I can pull together for you. The macroeconomic questions are all about the longer term implications of the stimulus that's being pumped into the economy right now. Do you think that we're going to see a takeoff of inflation either in Europe or in the United States as a result of that? And before you answer that, we also want to think about this in terms of the debt volume. You had these estimates of the amount of debt that had built up before the crisis. Now that we know that the debt is going to go much larger, what is the likelihood that this is ever going to be paid back?
So let's start from the last point, where the likelihood of payback. Here we're talking about the debt from advanced economies, and of course I focus on that. One of the previous questions dealt with what's going on with developing and low-income countries, and we know that there is a massive amount of capital flight, which is particularly tragic for those countries, which in the past, in recent years, have benefited from actually an expansion of private lending, and now they see capital just moving out. But that, in a sense, as terrible as it is, and as many consequences that can produce, is kind of an old story, an old movie that we keep on seeing over and over. Here, this is a new thing, okay? If advanced economies were to stop paying back their debt, as tremendous as it is, the amount of financial disintegration that this would produce would be just unprecedented. So, paying back, just thinking in these terms of just sheer default is not going to bring you very far, because it's very unlikely to happen. Which doesn't mean that there are not there will not be subtle way in place to reduce the burden of these crazy debt, or this, by crazy I mean just a humongous amount of debt. Now we just have to be careful, though. Our likelihood to pay back this debt and the sustainability of this debt for advanced economies depend on one thing only, which is our ability, of the two sides of the shock that I talked about before, our ability to restore our productive capacity. Right now, as things stand, this is very unclear. I mean, it's clear that some countries are moving faster than others, but it's unclear how quickly it will take to go back to the previous level of production. Now we have to understand that if this doesn't happen, we will not be able to pay back the amount of resources, fiscal first, but also monetary, that we put in place to deal with the amplification mechanism, which is just the demand shock coming from this supply shock. So here the question about debt sustainability, or if you want, and also is about our ability to go back to a level of supply, so production, that we had before. This is obviously tightly connected with the issue of inflation. What is inflation here? Okay. Think about it. Did we create inflation? Was inflation something that we generated in our past experience of supply shock? Yes, it happened. If you go back in your memory to the oil shock that happened in the 70s and 80s, we know that it produced inflation. Partly because, sure, price of oil goes up, and all the things that use oil that at the time were a lot more than today, increase in their prices. But inflation remained there. Remained there because we did not understand the nature of that shock back then, and we used a lot of demand policy, especially in the 70s, to fight against a supply shock. And what was the consequence of that? Inflation. Can the same problem appear even in this case? Of course it can, right? If once again, it's a matter of if you just support demand and supply doesn't pick up, you're going to get inflation. But here, there's reason to be skeptical about that. So it is a possibility, right? Just if anything, this is what we learned from the oil price shock. But it's unlikely in this case. Why is it unlikely? Because what we are seeing here is that as much as we give money to people to spend whatever we think, to consume whatever they consume, or to, if you're a company, to deal with liquidity, we see that they're retrenching in terms of their plan. Aggregate demand is shrinking, consumption is falling, investment is falling. And why is that? Because of course people are concerned about the future, right? So demand is basically following supply in this downward spiral that, unless we stop it, will of course bring about a contraction of our level of economic welfare, but for sure will not produce inflation. So as much as you want to be concerned about inflation, and there are reasons to be, I would put that as definitely a second order, because the first order here is that you get into this very poor spiral where supply shock determines a demand shock, and supply and demand follow each other in a downhill, which will just make all of these unsustainable, okay? And just thinking about it, oh, we can get out of it through inflation, it's unlikely to be the case here, unless you think about something like the nuclear bomb of monetary policy, which is helicopter money. So the central bank of advanced economies stepping in and saying, I'm sorry, that just doesn't make any sense. We're going to buy it all. We're going to take the loss in our balance sheet. But this is, you don't need me to tell you that this is actually highly problematic, not just in Europe, where this would be like, would bring into conflict different member countries, but this would not be an easy cup of tea to drink, even in the United States.
That's terrific, Filippo. Nina, I want to come back to you because we're getting some questions about the nature of the response. And I wonder if I could draw on your New Zealander expertise to help us better understand both how some countries have responded better and how some organizations have responded better. So I guess let's start with the countries. Do you think that the countries that have responded best to this crisis are those countries that have the most cooperative domestic politics? Is it something about cooperative countries versus, I guess, market countries that we should be paying attention to? And then with respect to the international system, were there regimes that responded better than other regimes, like the European Union, well or less well, compared to other regional organizations or even UN organizations like the IMF and the World Bank? Do they have a particular role to play in the response that we craft? If you could help us to understand that, that would be very helpful.
Great. It's not often I get asked for my New Zealandish expertise, so I'm always happy to give that. In answer to the first question, which countries are best? I think there's obviously a lot of commentary from public health officials, which is probably more informed around public health than I as an IR scholar, so I would defer to them. But what I have read, and I'm sure others on this webinar will have other views on this, is that a number of countries that face the SARS epidemic, so Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, did really well. They knew how to deal with this because they had already been through a crisis. So I think there it's not necessarily about regime type, because we have a mix of types there, but more about the fact that their health and governance systems had recognized how you have to deal with a virus through testing, through contact tracing, and what has been attempted to be replicated elsewhere now, albeit a little bit slower in the UK and other countries. One small note I would make, though, about the international regime and learning on that fact is that Taiwan, because of its unusual status as not being accepted as a member state of the WHO, that's the World Health Organization, has not been able to share its expertise. And the reason it can't share its expertise and be a member state is, of course, because China is blocking Taiwan. And as many of you will know, China is very reluctant and, well, outright refuses to recognize China as a country. And I think that's a really interesting ramification of some of these global geopolitical problems, is that we have a country that has learned how to deal with it well. The WHO is set up precisely for the reason of countries to share technical information and to figure out what is the best way to monitor and respond. And so that countries at the beginning of the outbreak, would go to the WHO and say, so what do we do if this virus is on our doorstep? And Taiwan was unable to use that channel to spread its expertise and experience. So I think there's been quite a lot of commentary written around that issue. On my own country, just to reflect a little bit on New Zealand, which did not face SARS, I think the kind of qualities that have been mentioned a lot in the international press and also in the domestic has been a sense of leadership from Jacinda Ardern that is both very strong. So she was one of the first countries that to call a lockdown before there were any deaths or even that many cases. The lockdown in New Zealand has been very, very strong. In fact, my family there have been in what they call a bubble, which means that they cannot see anyone else outside their own household. And a bit like in many other countries around the world, limited exercise outdoors a couple of times a day, but otherwise staying indoors. And that's in a country where there have been, I think, about 12 to 19, I think it might have gone up to 19 deaths overall. And the reason partly she can make these really strong calls is because she's seen as an empathetic leader. She's a very good communicator. She uses Facebook Live to go on screen just before the lockdown to say to people in her track pants, I know this is going to be hard, but we're all going to pull our weight in here. So I could speak much more to her role as a leader, which I think has been applauded, and she has had a lot of support. So that's on the first question, which countries did best. On the regimes, I guess it's very hard to compare across quite different regional governments or regional governance schemes, as well as across different international organizations. If we look to some of the big international organizations like the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, they've certainly been trying to do the best they can. I think the spring meeting, which I mentioned earlier, of the World Bank and the IMF were examples of their leaders of respective agencies, IMF and World Bank. The World Bank, I should note, also came out with a coronavirus help and assistance, but I think it was only about 14 billion. I'd have to check the numbers there. So much smaller than a lot of the bailouts that my colleague Filippo was just talking about. So there has been leadership there, but I think it's really tough times for these international organizations, precisely because all of the member states are, huddled domestically, looking to their own populations and how to get flights to bring them back, Germans stranded in New Zealand or Peru, or Brits stranded in Peru. And so the thought of engaging multilaterally, I think, has been a bit on the back seat, as the example of the UN that I gave previously.
Terrific. Thanks, Nina. Mike, I've got a bunch of questions on multilateral trade, and particularly on the distributive consequences of multilateral trade that I wonder if you could address. One of the questions has to do with the more traditional left-wing critique of multilateral trade, which is that free trade may be welfare enhancing, but it seems to benefit some groups more than others. And I wonder if you could talk about that, particularly as there seems to be a concern that maybe Nina was wrong in characterizing this as a rich country's problem. This is a trading country's problem, because the more interconnected countries were, the more readily they were exposed to the novel coronavirus. The other question, or side of this question, is about the support for multilateral trade arrangements within Asia. Given the distributive consequences that these agreements imply, how much are Asian leaders willing to pay in political terms in order to generate the support that's needed to bring them into being?
Again, very interesting questions. I think it's inevitable that with increases in efficiency, almost inevitable, with increases in efficiency, you have structural change such that some people win more than others. In fact, some might win and some might lose. Now, this is true with technology, which is a major job disruptor, if you will, much more so than trade, or artificial intelligence, or trade. I mean, what's going to happen when you have these factors are rearranged such that you have increased efficiency, the factors have to be rearranged. So you're going to have some winners and some losers. So what this ends up being is it creates a public policy challenge that most countries do a very bad job of addressing. Because, after all, if I lose my job, is it that much worse if I lose my job in Michigan because of competition from North Carolina or competition from Windsor, Canada? You know, the important thing is I lost my job, or if I lose my job because of Amazon or something else. What I need to do is I need to be carried over. I need to have some sort of compensation. I need to be retrained. I need to be hooked up with perhaps other jobs and these things. And so this way of compensating, you know, the definition of efficiency means that overall the country can afford this kind of redistribution. It just needs the will to do it and the mechanisms to do it efficiently. And some countries have done a better job than others. But this is a big issue for everything. And I think that unfortunately, sometimes, even though I believe that general approaches to job disruption are best, in other words, it doesn't matter what I lose my job due to, sometimes you have programs like the United States Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, which are notoriously inefficient and don't do much, very difficult to meet the criteria, et cetera. And there's not much there anyway. And so from a political point of view, okay, it shows that the government is trying to do something for people displaced by trade, but it would be better to have really an approach that makes a difference in people's lives, that people that lose their jobs and need to be reintegrated into the workforce. And I think it really is a very important point to move forward. I might also mention that protectionism itself creates losers and then more losers. So you also have that problem too. I mean, we saw that originally when the Trump administration came in and put Section 301 tariffs on steel. This hurt very badly now downstream industries, for example. And that has a negative effect, and it really didn't do any miracles to the steel industry anyway. So there's also a problem there. Okay, and with respect to the second question about support for free trade in Asia and these regional arrangements, I think if you look at the agreements today, they tend to be softer than in the West for that very reason. If you look at the Asean Economic Community, for example, which technically began to be in effect in December of 2015, it uses that word economic community that's got a lot of baggage. European Economic Community, and they knew it had baggage, but they defined it to be much more politically invasive, if you will, than in the European context. Free flow of goods, great. Free flow of services, all right, it's difficult, but we could take that. Free flow of labor, are you kidding? No way. There's no way you're going to get Singapore and Brunei to allow free flow of labor from Indonesia and from Malaysia. It's just not going to happen. And so it was reduced to being free flow of skilled labor, mostly to support free flow of foreign direct investment, because creating an environment in which you could have, you know, a regional production network in ASEAN, so it could do things like compete with China for foreign direct investment and globally, is a big priority. So things like the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, I've heard characterized as being more of an investment agreement than a trade agreement, because it's about bringing foreign investment into the region. And so that's okay, but forget about all labor flows and forget about free flow of capital. The Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s really hurt the region. It's still influential in regional leaders' thinking. And that kind of open liberalization of financial markets is pretty much taboo in the region right now. The idea of being able to, the right to be able to impose capital controls is firmly entrenched. So you're not going to see that. So in a way, these Asian efforts are not nearly as deep, if you will, as in the case of Europe. And also, if you look at the things like the TPP, it was interesting because most countries, developing countries in Asia that, with the exception of Vietnam, really felt that the TPP was going to be okay for them, but it really was an agreement that really favored the United States. The United States got the most out of it. As a matter of fact, in our modeling work, we showed the United States got the most out of it. And so they were nervous about it. So there's a political content as well. By the way, that's why I thought it was quite ironic when in his first day of office, President Trump tore up the TPP saying it was really bad for America because all the partners thought it was only good for America, or mostly good for America. So I think the politics are behind there, but the governments are much more hesitant to go into things that are going to be too disruptive. And so therefore it doesn't rankle as many political objections as you have, say, in Europe or in North America. Now, in order to have deep integration, those political constituencies are going to have to be rankled, and that'll be interesting to see how that moves forward.
Terrific, thanks, Mike. But Filippo, I'm getting a lot of questions about the changes in the way we do business, and particularly about the rise of economic nationalism in Europe. And the questions take a number of different forms. One is about whether the supply chain disruption is actually going to lead to the reemergence of national champions and to permanent changes in European state aid rules. Another is whether it's going to actually build in support for those politicians who are less enthusiastic about European integration and much more nativist in their outlook. And then a third aspect of this, which I think is actually very curious, which is why is it that given we all believe supply chains are going to be so disrupted, many of the stock exchanges in Europe and the United States have not responded so dramatically to the disruption that we believe is going to take place?
All right, thanks. These are excellent questions. So let's start from understanding what is the risk, what's at stake, and then of course how do we deal with it, okay? So if we look at the core, the most visible success of globalization, trade integration, financial integration has been across the globe, and particularly within the European Union and the Eurozone especially, is the fact that it's very hard to find some product, some production that is entirely self-contained within the national border of a country. It's very hard. And it wasn't the case until a few decades ago. So this creation of value chain is actually, it acts as an insurance mechanism. Because we are so attached to one another, in the face of shock, we are also, we can't allow that one of us basically drags away the rest of us. And of course, this means that as long as the shock affects just one bit of the chain, we can think about substituting that link in the chain. But if the shock hits the entire value chain, then the existence of the value chain per se is actually acts as a reinforcement mechanism, some sort of forces coordination in the response. Okay. Not surprisingly, we're getting a lot more discussion regarding fiscal coordination in Europe, a topic we've been dealing with since we started the European integration project. But now it's a very important issue, not just because of the severity of the crisis, but because there is an understanding that if the Italian don't produce car components, that's going to pose a threat for car production in Germany and actually, or in Austria, actually for car components too. And if the Italian economy doesn't recover, well, then you're going to need to have far less demand for the output of the car industry. So this existence, this level of integration is actually beneficial, and it's actually is a buffer against the resurgence of economic nationalism. But there is, of course, temptation that every policymaker is subject to. In the United States, but especially in Europe, where we have a stronger tradition in that sense, that is of rather than build up of a national champion, of state intervention, government intervention in the structure of the economy. I mean, I don't think there is, we're not talking about the vision here of really building a national champion for something, but rather letting the state or the different level of government slip more thoroughly into the network of production. This is very appealing to every policymaker, right? Because it's a way to expand your reach, your influence, and this is the perfect time when you can do it, go undetected, and actually get even a few applause for it. So this is really the risk. The risk is not really about disintegration of Europe, or at least not through that, but it's a risk about the resurgence of state intervention. We've dealt, so if you believe that state intervention is the best thing on earth, this is the time for you, okay? The next years are actually going to be the time for you. But if you believe that, we had a little bit too much of that the experience in the 80s and the 90s didn't really speak that about a great success in that dimension, then you're obviously going to be disappointed as we go ahead. Leave it to that. Money. I mean, that amount of debt that we talked about is there as a threat on all of us, right? To remind us that we can go as extreme as maybe some of our policymakers wish for. Okay, so now you have to be careful about an interesting dynamic. What does the market expecting? What are people expecting when we look at that, at all that's going on? And I think that explains a lot of the dynamic in the stock prices that were raised. We all think that this shock to the value chain, as severe as it is temporary. Now, this is not granted. This is where I get concerned. I understand. I think the most likely outcome is that the baseline scenario is that in 6 months from now, we will look at this with a lot of comfort, and a year from now we'll be in a really safe territory. But I think it's a baseline. But the baseline is not sure. There is this risk, but it's not a tail risk. It's actually risk is something that can happen. That disruption happens there. Right now, it's not priced in, meaning that the vast majority of investors do believe that the shock is in fact a temporary in its effect. It's severe, but it's not persistent, okay? And this is not granted for the dynamic that I was talking about it before. For that interaction between demand and supply, that if we're not careful enough in managing, can actually bring about the disruption of value chain. And if that happens, then all the populist, anti-European Union parties, but in general, all the parties, political forces around the globe that advocate a clear, neater sense of national interest are going to have the time of their life. Because at that point, there will not be an economic backbone, value chain to actually push against them, okay? But they will have the perfect excuse to say, you know what? We can't rely on our suppliers or an external market, so this is the time to invest in domestic market, this is the time to invest in domestic suppliers. And the moment in which that rhetoric, which is just cheap rhetoric because it goes against the principle of comparative advantage in the international specialization, as that happens, because supply is not picking up, well then, but only then we'll be in trouble, okay? This is what we should be looking at, and this is the real risk. But it's a risk. Let's not consider it as the baseline.
Thank you, Filippo. Nina, I want to try to push us beyond the sort of palliatives that governments have introduced to mitigate the symptoms of this crisis, and to ask you if you can look ahead to see any deeper structural change. And the structural change that I think people are most interested in is, on the one hand, related to the environment, whether this is going to allow governments to pursue more environmentally responsible agendas. And the other hand, toward migration. And if you could talk about these things, not just with respect to the policies that might be adopted, but also because of your expertise with respect to the politics that will come behind them, to what extent these are going to be globally motivated agendas that we're going to have to address.
Great, thanks for that, Erik. A good big question for me to chew on, and I'll see how much I can answer it. I think from what I've seen in the discussions on the first topic around climate and what's often called just transition, so how do we transition to an economy not based on fossil fuels, but one based on green renewable energies, but in making that transition, we do it fairly. So workers who are working in those fossil fuel industries are compensated and assisted. I've been following those conversations quite a lot. And I think there is a real emphasis that we need to use this time now. So that's the first point I'd make. There was a big Earth Day in the US. So some of our listeners may have attended that. That was put online. Greta Thunberg, that is the leader of Fridays for Future, met with the head of Potsdam Climate Institute, one of the leading scientific institutes on climate change, just over a week ago, to also talk about how do we rethink the economy. New Zealand's climate minister, who's also the leader of the Green Party, has come out very strongly making these same claims that we need to be investing in clean, renewable energy and public transport, and bike lanes is another big thing. So the short answer is there are a lot of voices, and they're the voices that we would expect to hear, right? These are the climate scientists, the climate activists, the Green members of parliament, also people like Merkel who've been saying this. I think for many others, in terms of the politics of it, this is just going to be kicked down the road. I don't think solving climate change is on the top of most politicians' agendas who weren't already sympathetic to it. If they were sympathetic, yeah, they may use this moment and this time. But I think because of what already my colleagues and Filippo have outlined, some really difficult political decisions that leaders like in the Eurozone are making, it's just a bit hard to handle, is my sense. And they've got to think about, bailing out national airlines. Lufthansa in Germany, right, is asking for millions, if not billions of state aid. And so I guess we'll have to see how even a country like Germany, which is trying to take leadership on this, but yet will probably bail out an element of the airline industry as well as the car industry. But I do think we can expect to see continual strong push and voices to think about a Green New Deal. And yeah, it'll be, I'm hopeful that there will be some countries that at least can lead on that. I should just a quick side note on that topic. The UNFCCC annual negotiations, which normally would have been held this December in Glasgow in Scotland, have obviously been postponed due to COVID. So in terms of international politics, we won't be having any major international summits on climate change this year. So in terms of international agreements, we'll also have to wait for some time before we know how countries are doing vis-a-vis the Paris Agreement. So on migration, this is also a thorny topic. There's been a lot written in the last few weeks, particularly around labor migrants. For those in Europe, they're probably aware of debates about how in the Netherlands and Germany, the Spargel or the asparagus season is right now upon Germany and the Netherlands, which is like white gold, this food. And of course, this food relies on migrant workers, mostly from Eastern Europe, Romanians. And interestingly, Germany made a decision to fly in several thousand when the borders were closed to everyone else to collect asparagus. Now, I use that as an example. It's not, of course, the only one. There are other countries. Italy relies on a lot of seasonal workers. And there are a lot of questions right now about, that decision, why migrants for asparagus and not refugees sitting in Greece. And there's been a lot of campaigning that I've been following around pushing the German government to accept more unaccompanied minors from the refugee camps who are stuck in Greece. And two, what happens to these migrants once they arrive? What are the conditions they're in? How do we make sure that their health doesn't jeopardize others, or vice versa, that COVID isn't spread? And there has been one so far that I'm aware of, Romanian who has died in Germany. It's a bit unclear from what I've read. There may be more updates whether or not it was from COVID. And so I think the flow of seasonal workers, not to mention skilled workers like we have, of course, at SAIS, teachers coming in to teach our classes, is all a big question mark. And I don't think anyone knows right now how that's going to pan out. It's going to be a really tricky one to see how different sectors get opened up. I think building on some of the comments Filippo was making, in some sectors that are seen to be essential, like agriculture and like the food industry, we may see some migrants. And what is essential will be a big question, and what isn't. And I'm very curious to see how that follows. In terms of international leadership, I haven't really seen much yet, but maybe I've missed something. So please inform me.
That's a great segue into another set of questions. We've got about 5 minutes left of question and answer. So Mike, I'm going to ask you a couple of very different questions, and then Filippo will finish with you. Mike, the two questions for you, one of them has to do not so much with trade, but with tourism and the extent to which we're ever going to be able to restore the tourist sector, and what are the implications if we cannot not least in countries like Italy that are fairly tourist dependent, but also perhaps in other parts of the world as well. The second question, though, is the one that follows on from what Nina said. You made a point in your presentation about the need for leadership. And I guess the question is, where do you expect this leadership to come from? The leadership that's going to push us forward as we respond to this crisis and build a new economic world order?
Okay, well, if we're looking at, to take the last question first on leadership, that's an excellent question. I mean, we've got a liberal order that was developed, after World War II, essentially by the United States. And since I'm doing a trade here, the US was instrumental in sort of leading the current global institutional order that sort of manages international trade. So, and this was true all the way up to the current administration. And so, since the US played this leadership role, it was, pushing things forward. The system is now trying to recalibrate since the Trump administration is going the opposite direction. In his inaugural speech, Trump said, protectionism will lead to great prosperity, which literally contradicted all of US policy since 1948, probably. And so, the leadership isn't going to be coming from that administration. So what happens in the future, I'm not sure. There's an election in November, but if that continues, it certainly is true the leadership is going to have to come from elsewhere. I think Nina mentioned something interesting, that actually China is trying to play a leadership role in this. President Xi has come out as a globalist to try to compare himself to Trump. A lot of people have called him on it, saying that he's globalist in rhetoric, but not so much in practice. But in any event, he sees the usefulness of trying this and the need to fill that vacuum. China is the second largest economy in the world. China has been doing major projects like the Belt and Road Initiative that Nina mentioned, which is going to come with it eventually, between, especially in loans, et cetera, but, a multi-trillion-dollar package to link the infrastructure of trade. That's a big initiative. And together with some policy initiatives, I think China is trying to play its role. But I think that there really isn't an escape away from having Europe play a role as well. I know it's much more difficult. Europe is a complicated group of 27 countries, and trying to have policies to go in that direction is hard. But Europe is, in general, European policy is pro-international trade, pro-multilateralism, pro-global markets, and has been negotiating agreements with a variety of countries that tend to be in favor of these open markets. A lot of them with Asia, for example. It could be with Japan or with Vietnam, sitting down with Asean, et cetera. So I think that in some ways, Europe can also play a major role in trying to, fill that leadership gap, at least as one exists. Hopefully the US will come back at some point. Now, in terms of tourism, I guess this very much depends on how long you anticipate the COVID-19 crisis to last. I think a lot of projections, if you look at the projections of the IMF and many other, the Asian Development Bank, you see this big turnaround next year. People are expecting things to pick up. And so this could be this demand shock that's going to be relatively short term, that would lead to a comeback. And so you're not going to have the kind of, forever structural change away from tourism. As a matter of fact, with higher incomes, with more middle-class countries, et cetera, I would expect 5 years from now, we'll be at least back on track in terms of tourism trade. Again, you can't tell the future, but that would be my guess. Can I say one thing though, since just to say something to support something Filippo said about these supply chains. I think that there is, because I've been seeing a lot of literature out there, that people are really worried about the fact that there's going to be this big push towards protectionism because people are going to want to have local supply chains rather than sourced from abroad. And the COVID thing is just one thing that's making people think that way. I think that's really the wrong way to think about it. Relying on just a few suppliers within your own economy, in my view, is much riskier than relying on many, many suppliers abroad. Because if you only have a few suppliers domestically, you could have competition problem, you've got less variety, and you could have reliability problems there too. So I don't think necessarily that something like COVID-19 is really going to disrupt those things medium long term.
Super, thanks, Mike. Filippo, I'm going to give you the last round of questions. We're going to have to make it a little bit tight. So one of the two questions has to do with whether we're at the limits of monetary policy, and being at the limits of monetary policy, whether we have enough time to actually absorb the supply side shock that we need to absorb in order for the economy to get restarted, right? It seems as though we're running out of instrument before we're running out of shock, if you see what I mean. And the other side of this has to do with macroeconomic imbalances between China and the United States, or between Europe and the rest of the world, for example. Are we going to resolve those things, or are we simply going to survive this crisis in order to set up the next one? So is our future bright or dark? I guess, since we're going to have a drink after this, please give us an answer that's suitable for the beverage. So
about how bright the future is, I really don't know. I mean, I think everyone has his or her own opinion, and it's fine like that. Let's talk about risk. Let's talk about what can go wrong, so that we try to prepare for a brighter future. Okay. So what can go wrong here? Well, what can go wrong is the fundamental thing is that we manage the restart of our productive capacity too slowly, and with lacking asynchrony, so slowly and in such an uncoordinated fashion that we destroy the amount of integration that we have achieved over the last decades. That is the risk, okay? So that should be our number one priority right now. Let's move swiftly, safely, all right, but swiftly and coordinate in a coordinated manner, because that is issue number one. If to that purpose, let's talk about what we can do in the meantime and the role of monetary policy to deal with a supply shock. So number one, you do not solve a supply shock with monetary policy. I'm sorry, that is impossible. You cannot do it. Let's just put your heart to rest in that dimension. But there is one side effect, an important side effect of a supply shock that you can address with monetary policy. And that's where all the chip will be. We had, we created, the supply shock creates this liquidity shortage, right? And liquidity shortage stays there. So if liquidity shortage stays there for too much time, it starts to threaten your solvency, okay? So from lack of liquidity, you make lack solvency. And that is where the central bank will play a crucial role in supporting banks in actually providing the amount of liquidity. But then you have to ask a question, which is really the final question, okay, on which there was a very controversial and thought-provoking intervention. Once we deal with this liquidity crisis, and you accumulate all this extra debt in order to deal with that, what do we do with that extra debt? The former president of the European Central Bank, intervening on the Financial Times, talked for the first, with his style, about the need for cancellation of debt. Okay, what is the cancellation of debt? Is obviously talking about cancellation of private debt here. Okay, so these firms that are negatively affected, they have no reason to be blamed, but they have this extra liquidity needs. Well, let's take that debt away from them, which means that somebody else has to take care of it. Who is that somebody else? And there is only one candidate for that, and it's the government. And there is therefore only one backstop if government takes care of that, and that is once again central bank. So central bank will play this crucial role in dealing with the amount of liquidity that we injected, because it was the necessary solution, but will need to be managed in the years to follow. I don't know whether that provides for a brighter or darker future, but that's what it is.
Super. Thank you, Filippo. Filippo, Mike, Nina, this has been a really terrific conversation. Mike, I'm going to hand over to you to introduce us to the next phase. I think you need to invite us to some kind of spritz or something, if I'm not mistaken.
Anyway, thanks, Erik, for moderating this session in a very interesting way, and to my fellow panelists. I think what's really interesting is that, I mean, on this panel, we seem to agree on most things, but you know, at the lunch table, we do not always agree on things. So I don't want you to think that we've got some sort of monolithic way of viewing these things. But what I see a lot in everything that we're saying are trade-offs. And I mean, with COVID-19, we've got trade-offs. We extend the lockdown, it's going to, the economic hit is longer and the poor are getting hit the worst. With respect to environmental protection and things, it's always a trade-off. And what we try to do at SAIS is essentially give people the tools that they need to address these trade-offs and to make decisions in a way that is, you know, empirically based and rational and taking all things into consideration. So SAIS has always done that sort of a thing. And I think this is something that's going to dominate our approach for the next 65 years. Anyway, as Erik said, I'd like to invite everyone now to a Spritz reception. So please leave this room and connect to the room where the link is being shared on this chat, and which you hopefully have received by email. So we'll see you in the time it takes to move to that room and get a glass of Spritzer. Thanks, everybody.